Hi everyone. Welcome to uh, I think week 9 or week 10, depending on how you count it, with spring break. I hope everyone has been able to have a relaxing break. Now we're gonna get back to it for just a few more weeks, and then we'll be approaching the end of the semester. As I mentioned, I think in the last video, but definitely at least in an announcement, now the class is sort of taking a pivot, right? Up to this point, we've been discussing rationalist philosophers. So we've been discussing philosophers who thought that sort of the foundations of our knowledge are these pure ideas, right? They're things that we get through reason alone, whose sort of model is a kind of mathematical knowledge, right? And they associated this with sort of the rise of Galilean science, right? And this is a big part of Descartes' dualism too, right? A lot of people, whenever they think about Descartes' dualism, is they think about its problems, or maybe they're very skeptical of Descartes' idea of a pure thinking subject or something like that, and we're actually going to discuss that a little bit today in today's video. But another aspect of Descartes' dualism is his account of bodies, right? Descartes' account of bodies states that bodies are defined fundamentally by their extension. So what it does is it makes a certain kind of inquiry into the world, scientific inquiry, mathematical, right? Quantifiable. There's a reason why mathematics is, sort of the language of nature, and it's at the foundation of the scientific disciplines that were sort of like leading the charge into modernity, specifically, astronomy and physics, right? And so one way of thinking about the early modern period and thinking about the authors that we've discussed up to this point is just how impressed they were with specifically Galilean approaches to physics, which, do have some earlier forebears, right? But what they see in it, that they see as sort of the monumental difference in approach with earlier scientific inquiry, is that it is guided, solely sort of through mathematical kind of principles, right? And so this is why they interpreted their own rationalist programs as really sort of being of a piece with the sort of contemporary scientific developments. They showed how and why such developments are possible, but they also sort of exhibited the same style of reasoning, right? They see as being foundational to these kind of approaches, right? And so the next big intellectual tradition that we're going to be discussing has a very different interpretation of what has sort of spurred the development of modern science, right? And so one way that people kind of a lot of the times think about the early modern period is that the rationalists, they are not scientific in some way, that they downplay the importance of scientific inquiry, that it can only play a derivative role in our knowledge or something to that effect. But I hope that what I've just said is sort of illuminated why I think that that approach is misleading, right? If you actually look at it, I mean, a lot of the rationalists actually were scientists, right? So clearly they didn't just think that scientific knowledge or experimental knowledge is unimportant or something like that, right? To the contrary, they thought that their own metaphysical endeavors, as we saw in Du Châtelet, sort of played a foundational role for the development of modern science, right? And specifically, even though there are all these kind of disagreements that happen ultimately between Leibniz and Newton over, the calculus and all of that, right? Du Châtelet sort of argues that Leibniz is foundational for, even the possibility of Newtonian mechanics, right? And so I would caution us against thinking about the distinction between the rationalist and the empiricist as like a distinction between people that like science and people that don't like science, right? It's instead more like what the rationalists and the empiricists get out of, or what they interpret as being excuse me, sorry about that, bumped the desk, sort of like the central achievement of modern science, right? That's what they're interpreting differently, right? And I think that starting with sort of the scientific foundation sort of helps you understand um, the sort of basic structure of the arguments and the kind of ethos of empiricism. And ethos is just sort of like, I don't know, it's style, right? Sort of the things that it tends to think of as important, the sort of things that empiricists want to defend. Like I mentioned, how they interpret the development of modern science, right? All very different, right? And so I've written up here at the top of the board empiricism versus rationalism because we're going to introduce Locke's notion of empiricism in this lecture, and then we're going to get more into the weeds in the next lecture. And so we're going to give his basic program here in roughly the first half, might take slightly more than the first half. And then in the second half, we're going to discuss this response from Leibniz. And this is going to be the last that we're really hearing from the rationalists in this class. And this is like one reason why I really love Leibniz is that he wrote this book that was sort of like a line-by-line response to Locke. So Leibniz not only sort of engaged with his contemporary rationalists quite a lot, he also engaged with John Locke's essay concerning human understanding and wrote his own version. He wrote the new essays concerning human understanding. Isn't that funny? That is so petty. I love it. I love this aspect of it. One thing that was maybe less petty about it, though, is this book was never released. Leibniz never published it during his lifetime because Locke died before he could finish the book. And so he kind of thought it was lame or uncouth or something like that, to sort of release this book that's a line-by-line refutation of Locke who just died. And he has a lot of respect for Locke, actually. And that, I think, really comes out in the small section that we're reading for this week. Okay, so that's sort of the itinerary for the rest of this lesson. Sort of thinking about, like, why is it that these two approaches are opposed? What are they disagreeing about? What are sort of the foundations of empiricism? Because we're going to be delving more and more into that moving forward. And then also, always kind of keeping in the back of our minds, how would the rationalists sort of respond to this kind of stuff, right? Because, I think that especially this exchange shows is that there's a lot of very fruitful stuff to be gained by thinking about these two intellectual traditions in conversation with one another. So that's what we're going to try to do for this week's video. Okay. So the first thing that you read was Bacon, right? And Bacon published this book, The New Organon. And typically, this book is thought about as being the first book to sort of develop or propose anything like a scientific method, right? So that's quite a big deal, right? And also, something that's worth keeping in mind is he's Anglican, right? He's from the UK, and a lot of sort of the intellectual tradition in empiricism is going to be, on the British Isles in general, and a lot of this period is also kind of known as the Scottish Enlightenment. We're going to be reading David Hume in a few weeks. We're going to be reading a whole book by him about epistemology, and he's really foundational to that kind of movement. But really, I think that you can kind of trace the vitality this tradition back to Bacon's new Organon. And really, the central advance that it makes, in my opinion, is it emphasizes the importance of experiment and experience. And he considers those as the foundation for a new approach to knowledge. So, what did he have in mind by that? Well, one way of characterizing his sort of skepticism towards a lot of religious beliefs at the time, beliefs about nature, right, is that we can know about nature from knowing sort of like deeper or broader metaphysical facts about the the universe, right? But about what God would do, right? And so you can answer biological questions by asking, like, well, why would God put this animal, right, in this habitat or something like that, right? And you can already just sort of assume, well, nature's ordered because there's God, right? And if it's ordered, then there must be some reason for why the animal's here rather than there, it's something like that, right? You can engage in that kind of reasoning. That kind of reasoning is fallacious, right? It leads you to a whole bunch of beliefs about the world that are wrong, right? That you just arrived at solely because of your preconceived superstitions about what the world is like, right? Bacon is sort of proposing an alternative approach, a scientific approach, one where you don't sort of enter with preconceived opinions about the way that the world is, but you genuinely go out and consult your experience and you experiment, right? You shouldn't begin with these super high level metaphysical beliefs about like what God is like or something like that, and then reason down to particular things. That totally reverses the operation that really happens. What really happens ultimately is you get evidence, right, from particular events, particular experiences that you have or experiments that you set up, and you sort of build knowledge from the accumulation of all of this stuff, right? You have more and more experiences, and then you generalize from them. Right? And yes, to some extent, the rationalists are right that this sort of knowledge is, I don't know, in some ways it's kind of weaker in the sense of it can be modified later through additional evidence. But Bacon sees that as a virtue, right? That is not a problem with experiment. It just describes what experiment does, right? And this gives you the best kind of knowledge that you could really have about the world. You can never be certain about, metaphysical theses that you have about the world, about the nature of God, right? And you couldn't even come up with a method to figure out how to prove it wrong to someone else, or so making claims at least, right? And so really you should start from particulars, right? That you can regulate, right? You can conduct experiments in nature to arrive at particular conclusions, right? And then you can build out a theory when it coheres with, when it's generalized from these particular truths, right? So one way of framing it is Bacon wanted to affirm the importance of particular truths, right? Not universal truths, not absolutely general truths, right? And so on. He wants to talk about particular truths, right? And then from there, general truths that we can infer from those particular truths. But not beginning with these sort of universal truths, absolutely, necessary things, right? Like Leibniz starts the monadology by being like, here's what substances are, right? Spinoza starts the ethics too by describing what God is and describing what substance is, right? And the idea is eventually you'll be able to get from that kind of knowledge to some sort of like particular actionable knowledge about the world, right? But what the empiricist says, in effect, is you never get from here to there, right? You never get from the absolutely universal truths to particular truths, right? And what we're interested in are particular truths. How should I live my life, right? What is the boiling temperature of water? How does electricity work? Stuff like this. These are the sort of questions that Bacon thinks that scientists and philosophers should be trying to answer, right? Not the absolutely general truths that theologians and rationalist metaphysicians are concerned with, right? Okay, I think you kind of get the point, right? The essence is just sort of that there's an emphasis on the importance of particular truths, the importance of things that we can confirm through experience and experiment. In many ways, sort of the main thing that we're reading for this week and what we'll continue to read into next week is Locke's essay concerning human understanding. And in many ways, you can think about this as sort of Locke philosophically implementing Bacon's sort of dictum for science, to focus on particular truths and experimental knowledge. This is sort of the philosophical statement of that sort of belief system, right? And so this is why I think it's cool to read Bacon and Locke side by side. It's just that Bacon sort of gives you in the more directly scientific context what Locke gives you in a philosophical context. And so you can really see how the philosophical texts sort of orient themselves around developing approaches in scientific texts, right? Okay, so I said that Locke's essay becomes the founding document for empiricism. And what the next sentence says is the thesis, or at least Locke's statement of empiricism, his belief about what empiricism at its foundation is a claim about, is that all knowledge, so not just the foundation of knowledge as we were talking about previously, but all knowledge stems from sensation and reflection, not innate ideas. Okay, and so in order to substantiate this sort of claim, we have to flesh it out, right? What is the difference between what Locke calls sensation and reflection versus innate ideas, right? Well, what Locke has in mind by sensations, basically what everyone up to this point has been talking about sensations. He's talking about ordinary human perception. You see a mug, right? Something like that. That's really what Locke has in mind by sensation. And then reflection is Locke's word for when you direct your attention not outwardly towards the things that you perceive, but inwardly towards the nature of your sensations as you've had them. So, like, I can sense, or, a beautiful mug or something like that, right? And then I can reflect on the qualities that it had that, I made me think that it was beautiful, right? This is sort of the model for what Locke has in mind, is that there's sources of knowledge that come from outside, namely through the senses, and there are sources of knowledge that come from inside, namely through attending, through thinking about, thinking over, reflecting upon your own sensations, right? Now, what Locke is rejecting is a thesis that Descartes held and Spinoza held, and as we'll see, Leibniz held a version of it, which states that there are certain kinds of ideas that God, you might remember this language from the Meditations, that God is sort of printed on our souls, right? And he has in mind like a wax signet, right? Like he just stamps it on you or something. Um, and one of those ideas is God, right? This is ultimately how Descartes proves the existence of God in the third meditation, in the Cartesian proof. As he says, we have some idea of God. It can't come from sensation. And because it can't come from sensation, it can't really come from reflection. So it must be, you know, its source must be God. And since the source must be God, we can be certain that God really exists, right? So Descartes explicitly believed that there were things like innate ideas, and that innate ideas served as the foundation of our knowledge, right? It's ultimately because we get God back that we know that there's not an evil deceiver, right? Okay. So Locke then frames his statement of empiricism as being specifically a rejection of this thesis that there are innate ideas that, God has sort of like imprinted on our souls like a signet, certain ideas, right? And the ideas that the rationalists would have in mind are specifically metaphysical ideas. So substance is in there, God is in there, and then also mathematical or logical ideas. Those are also in there, right? Okay. Um, so I guess I should have written this down here. Actually, I'll write it in this little corner here. Um, Probably the most famous phrase from Locke is that we are born tabula rasa, and I did not write that the neatest, but hopefully that's okay. Tabula rasa, which means as a blank slate, right? And so Locke has this picture about human beings where, we're kind of like a container, right? We get a bunch of experiences, right? Including, not only sensation, experiences from without, but also reflection, right? We reflect on the things that we have. And then that is the state of our knowledge, right? Is basically what we have accumulated over our life through our sensations and our reflections. That's what we come to know is in the world, right? Okay, so this is Locke's statement of empiricism, and his refutation of innate ideas. It's not going to look like what the rationalist refutation was, right? The rationalist refutation of each other are in many ways very complicated and often amount to saying that you contradicted yourself, right? And they'll develop these super long proofs. You might think about Spinoza's big long proof that there's one and only one substance at the beginning of the first book of the Ethics, right? That's one of them. Um, yeah, and you can also see sort of in the monadology, Leibniz is refuting various philosophical opinions by proving that they're self-contradictory, right? So Locke's not going to do that. Locke is not going to prove that, innate ideas are somehow contradictory, right? What he's going to say instead is that this thesis does not really match the evidence that we have, right? Locke almost sort of treats this philosophical thesis almost as if it were like a predictive thesis, right? As if, what Descartes is saying whenever Descartes says that we have the innate idea of a God, what he means is like basically that everyone in the world sort of has the idea of the Christian God like stamped in them, right? They all know, that there is a God or something like that, and that they've all like people that are not Christian then chose to reject this idea, right? That's what Descartes believes. We shouldn't hesitate to say, hey, that's really prejudiced and weird and Eurocentric, right? It definitely is, right? And also, Locke is weird and Eurocentrist and bizarre too, because like kind of a lot of his proofs in some ways are racist, right? Like he just kind of points to what he thinks of being a primitive country or nation, and then being like, see, they don't have the things that Descartes calls innate ideas. So there's no good guy here. Just to clarify, nobody in the early modern tradition, for the most part, gets out clean, right? So yeah, that's an important thing to know about this text. So Locke is going to say, okay, well, we can think about this thesis that um, okay, hi again. Sorry about that. My wife, for instance, made our fire alarm go off, but everything's okay. Okay, so we're gonna return to Locke, right? So Locke wants to say, okay, innate ideas, like let's test that almost as if it were a scientific hypothesis against the evidence that is available to us, right? And so Locke does things like ask, well, does everyone in the world believe in God, right? Because if Descartes' thesis is that the idea of God is somehow printed on our souls, right? Then why doesn't everyone believe in God, right? Why isn't everyone a Christian, right? Um, and so what Locke proposes, well, you can just kind of look at the world, right? You can see that there are many, he says atheist or savage or, a bunch of racist stuff like that. But we can leave all that aside, that stupid aspect of his description, and focus on the philosophically significant part, which is that, there's not universal assent to the ideas that, Descartes and Spinoza ultimately say are innate ideas, right? Spinoza at one point says that all of his definitions are innate ideas, right? Which means that, like, when you read them, you should just kind of know that they're true because they are sort of like the structure of truth or something like that printed onto your soul. Um, but Locke's point is, well, regardless of whether or not you think everyone should agree with you, the fact is that they don't, right? It does not seem like there are sort of like these immutable sources of absolutely certain knowledge that God just sort of like presses onto the soul of every human being, right? That just is proven false by the fact that there's so much disagreement over these topics already, right? So that means that the innate ideas thesis construed as saying that innate ideas are actually there, right? That innate ideas really exist, and that everyone has this idea of God or whatever that Descartes and or Spinoza have. That's just false, right? There's disagreement all over the world, not only about the specifics of the rationalist doctrine, but also about the very coherence of what they're doing, right? A lot of people are not rationalists, right? Or a lot of people do not believe in God, or a lot of people do not have perfect mathematical knowledge, like Descartes and Spinoza often seem to, I don't know, assume, perhaps, right? So a lot of his, style of argument is, testing this innate ideas as like a hypothesis against the evidence, right? So as far as innate ideas construed as actually there, they're false, right? That thesis is false. There are not innate ideas in everyone that everyone agrees with that are sort of like a source of eternal truth. Well, okay, you might say, hey, that's not really fair, to the rationalists, right? Descartes isn't saying that everyone in the world is a Cartesian or something like that, right? And Spinoza isn't saying that everyone in the world is a Spinozist, right? And so, maybe one way of interpreting what they're saying is that if you think it over or something like that, it's at least possible that you arrive at these things. And why is it possible that you arrive at them? Well, because, God pressed them on your soul or whatever, right? That's the sort of idea. And what Locke says to this is completely meaningless, right? Um, if if all that's being said is that it's possible to arrive at the ideas that Descartes and Spinoza, for example, arrive at, then that really weakens, I think, the nature of their claims, right? Because then innate ideas aren't the foundation of all of your other knowledge or something like that. They're just some beliefs that you can happen upon, right? And it's equally possible that you happen upon opposite beliefs, right? So in that interpretation, you know, it's not possible to maintain, as the rationalists do, that innate ideas are a source of knowledge, right? Because knowledge is supposed to be immutable, right? Or at least relatively immutable. It can't just be possibly true, right? We're concerned with things that are actually true. And so Locke thinks then, okay, well, I've assessed to this thesis that there's this source of knowledge called innate ideas. I've tried to investigate it every way I can think about construing it, right? And it just seems false. So really the only two sources of knowledge that are left are sensation and reflection, right? That's Locke's general argument. And also, as a sort of related argument, kind of side argument, right? He responds to this idea of Descartes that the intellect is, defined by thinking, like I am a thinking thing, right? And Locke's objection is, what about dreams, right? In dreams, you're not really thinking, right? You're definitely not thinking in the sense of like the pure rationalist philosopher or whatever, right? Descartes even describes them as being completely at odds with each other, right? So Locke's point is, well, you have to be more than just a thinking thing because there are moments in your life where you don't think, right? Dreams being one of them. So this is just another example where philosophers, sort of overeager about their own hypotheses, fail to assess it against the evidence, right? And in this case, the evidence is our experience, and we experience moments where we are not a thinking thing. So Descartes' thesis must be false. Okay, so this is a general vibe of Locke's argument against innate ideas and his statement of empiricism. And this is going to be really foundational for basically the entire rest of the semester, right? If Descartes in some ways sort of like set the agenda for the rationalists, then definitely Locke and Bacon set the agenda for the empiricists. But since, we're not going to be talking about the rationalists any longer, I figured, we would give them one last hurrah, right? We need to send them off well, right? It's not fair to introduce the empiricist tradition by piling objections onto the rationalists and not allow the rationalists any sort of response, right? So we're going to discuss Leibniz's response to Locke. And this, I think, is super, super interesting stuff, right? It gives you a really sort of clear image about how some of Leibniz's kind of weird or obscure metaphysical theses interact with objections that Locke makes to the rationalists, right? And Leibniz in general has a lot of respect for Locke. He thinks that Locke is like kind of almost right, that his objections to the other rationalists are true, right? But that there's a way of having sort of like a higher or more sophisticated kind of rationalism that he himself represents that can deal with these style of objections, and that he kind of argues over and over again, well, if Locke would consider my perspective, then he would find it pretty agreeable, right? He even compares his own debate with Locke as the debate between Plato and Aristotle, right? With Leibniz being more like Plato and Locke being more like Aristotle. So this is really the source for like conceiving of like the whole period as a debate between empiricists and rationalists, is because it really happens in this text. So it's a very interesting one. And essentially, Leibniz's response to Locke hinges on characterizing innate ideas in a way that is different than either of the options that Locke presents. And it involves the invention of a new modal category, right? So modal categories, they're words like possibly, necessarily, actually, contingently, right, and so on. And all of these categories sort of work together, right? If something is possibly the case, right, then it is necessarily true that it's not self-contradictory, right? If something is actually the case, it must be possibly the case, right? And so on, right? The ontological argument in many ways hinges on the relation between modal categories, right? It says sort of like, if God is possible, then God must be actual, right? So yeah, those are what modal categories generally do, and Leibniz invents a new one. That's so cool. I don't think that there's really anything like this in the entire history of philosophy prior to this. Is that Leibniz invents this category called the virtual. And what he has in mind by virtual is, remember when he defined a substance by saying that a substance virtually contains all of the predicates in the universe. And so what he means is sort of like latently, right? Like deep within, right? It carries within itself all of the predicates of all the universe, right? And just to briefly rehearse why, right? To know all of the facts about me, right? All of those facts are going to be related inferentially to other facts, right? Like certain facts about me because they're facts about human beings in general, right? You can maybe know very, very precise facts about certain molecules on my body interacting through knowledge of physics, right? And so Leibniz's point is that if you knew me adequately, you would know everything there is to know about me. And in knowing everything there is to know about me, you would know my place, right, in the universe, right? Which ultimately requires that you know the whole universe, right? But nonetheless, like there's some things like I am not a square, right? I do not exist in two dimensions, right? And so that predicate is not actually true of me, right? But it's virtually true of me, right? It has some sort of relationship to me, right? I can think, I can bear some sort of relationship to them, right? Like I can think of them, right? And so just in the way that every monad virtually contains all of the predicates in the whole universe, right? They contain it in some sort of like crystallized form, right? Leibniz claims that innate ideas are virtually contained in every human being. What he means is that they identify dispositions, right? So it's not actual, right? Because not everyone has them. And they're not possible because possible is too thin of a category, right? For something to be possible just means that it would be contradictory, that it's not internally contradictory, right? But Leibniz wants to claim not only are these ideas that you could possibly have, right? But they're ideas that you should have and that most people do develop, right? Okay, examples of innate ideas are mathematical knowledge, logical knowledge, metaphysical knowledge, and theological truths. So basically everything that the rationalists would think about as being purely a priori, independent of all of our experiences, right? You know, purely as a rational truth, right? One sort of like moment in this text that's really important is that Leibniz references the Meno, which is a Plato dialogue. Plato is, you know, for those of you where this is your first philosophy class, he's an ancient Greek philosopher, you know, roughly 300, 400 BC. And he's very important to the history of philosophy, right? And in this dialogue, the Meno, Plato tries to demonstrate that there are pure rational truths and that anyone can come to learn them, right? And the way that he proves this is in the dialogue, he has a character, Socrates, teach a slave sort of some mathematical knowledge, right? And sort of the essence of the discussion bears on Plato's sort of claim through Socrates that the slaves sort of had that kind of mathematical knowledge like in their soul, right? They just needed a teacher to help bring it out of them, right? It's not like the teacher made the mathematical knowledge true, right? They merely sort of enlightened you or enlightened you to something that you already kind of knew in some way, right? And so for Plato, what that was meant to demonstrate is that there's a purely rational dimension of our existence, and you can come to know it through philosophy, right? And you can see why Leibniz would identify in Plato, and especially in this moment, a very powerful ally, right? Because this is ultimately what Leibniz wants to claim about mathematical, logical, metaphysical, and theological truths, right? Is that while not in the way that Descartes or Spinoza said, right, they're in some way kind of imprinted on your soul, right? And so here's what Leibniz means by that. Leibniz's favorite examples to use in this text are veined marble and enthymemes. So veined marble, I don't know if I spelled that correctly. Oh well, veined marble. So what Leibniz has in mind is sort of like, you know, if you're a sculptor, right, then you work on, you know, a block of marble. And to say it's veined is to say that, you know, there are certain parts of the marble that are more tightly held together, right? They won't want to come apart, or, you know, if you break the vein, then the whole thing will sort of, you know, shatter down, right? The sculptor can't just sort of, as if you were in like a computer simulation or something like that, right? Like completely like just impose their own ideas onto this marble or this form, right? They have to sort of relate to, they have to bring out right? The David in the marble, right? And what that means is that you have to sort of deal with the fact that the marble is internally differentiated, right? And work around that and work with that, right? And that's what Leibniz thinks about our souls, right? Is that just like the marble is veined, right? It has certain dispositions towards like certain figures are more or less able to be cut out of it. Leibniz says certain ideas are more or less sort of like essential to the whole architecture of our souls, right? There's some beliefs that are so fundamental in relation to others that like you can't you have to sort of like build around it in some ways, right? And mathematical knowledge is a good example of that, right? It's not as if like every culture and every society has its own system of arithmetic, right? You might have different styles of notation, different mathematical notation or whatever, right? But the actual mathematical knowledge, like how you represent it, 2 plus 2 equals 4, right? There are certain things about our world, right, that hold true regardless of your experiences, right? These are facts of reason, Leibniz claims, right? So mathematical knowledge is one good example of that, right? But Leibniz also has in mind like logical truths, right? So like, let's say something like this, right? There are two pies of equal size, right? And I take part of one and you take a whole one, right? Leibniz says it is true, given what was just said, right? That you ate more than me, right? That's just part of what those words mean, right? It's not as if you could have a culture where that were not the case. It's not as if it were just possibly the case that a whole of something is bigger than a part of it, right? That's just fundamental to what those things mean, right? That's a fundamental logical law. And everyone believes that, whether they know it or not, right? And this is the other example, enthymemes. So an enthymeme is basically an argument that's incomplete because it's missing a premise, right? There's a suppressed premise, a premise that is essential for the argument to be true, right? But that is not explicitly evoked, right? Implicit, right? That's sort of the central category of Leibniz's analysis, is that innate ideas are implicit, right? Just because they're not explicit or merely possible doesn't mean that it's not possible that they're implicit, right? Okay, so what Leibniz has in mind is that the metaphysical truths or primary truths that you read in the text of that name, those function as suppressed premises in basically every argument, right? You can prove that someone contradicts themselves, right? But then you're assuming, that they can't contradict themselves, right? All of what Leibniz calls innate ideas or metaphysical theses or primary truths sort of function as these assumptions that we make and we have to make for any of our arguments to actually hold true, right? And so it's sort of like the structure of our whole reasoning process, right? Premises that don't come from experience, right? But that are vital to all of the judgments that we use even within experience, right? And so Leibniz will agree with Locke that, hey, the previous, rationalists, you're right that their construal of innate ideas is not right, right? But there's an alternative approach, one where ideas are virtual or implicit. They're dispositions to believe things, right? There's a reason why there's widespread agreement about mathematical knowledge, right? In a way that's different from the widespread disagreement about theological knowledge, right? Maybe not a good example for Leibniz, but You know what I mean, right? There are certain areas where there's massive amounts of disagreement, and there are certain areas where there's relatively more agreement, right? In mathematical knowledge and logical knowledge, you know, Leibniz thinks, yeah, we've more or less got those down to science. And Leibniz thinks eventually we'll get there with metaphysical and theological knowledge. Also, I just wanted to sort of continue this debate with Locke about the cogito, right? So Locke said, okay, well, there's certain aspects of our life where we're not thinking, like our dreams. So Descartes' thesis about our nature as an intellectual substance must be wrong, right? Okay, what's the response to Locke? Well, Leibniz uses the principle of continuity. What does that mean, right? In essence, what Leibniz says is, when you're asleep, it's not that you're not thinking. It's that the perceptions that you have are extremely indistinct and confused, right? So like Leibniz sort of refers to like when you're sleeping, you have like a very vague idea that someone's in the room, right? Or something like that, right? And so it's not that, and then that sort of enters your dream world and it becomes very confusing, all that kind of stuff, right? And so for Leibniz, it can't just be that like you go like all the way from a thinking thing to not a thinking thing and vice versa, right? That would be like a miracle, right? Instead, you should think about them as sort of like on a scale, right? There's a gradation of thinking, right? There's thinking extremely clearly, right? Like we have to do in mathematical knowledge. And then there's thinking very confusedly, like we do when we're asleep or hungry or in a stupor or whatever, right? And so this is an example of how Leibniz can retain, an element of rationalism, right? Thesis that we are thinking things, essentially, right? But to do it through invoking one of his primary truths, right? And then substantially changing the nature of the cogito, right? For Descartes, the cogito only referred to human beings. For Leibniz, it's every living thing that has a soul, right? And the principle of continuity explains why there are gradations, right? Why certain monads are more powerful than others. And another aspect of Leibniz's argument that I think is extraordinarily profound is he says, well, and if you think about it, this is going to sound crazy, but he's like, if you think about it, there are imperceptible perceptions that are contained in everything that you see. What does he mean by that? Well, he imagines, like, imagine an ocean, right? You don't have a clear and distinct perception of every drop in the ocean, right? You can't differentiate them, right? They kind of come to you as a giant haze, right? An indeterminate collective, right? And what Leibniz is saying is, yeah, and so like the things that you see clearly are composed of all of the stuff that you don't see clearly and you don't understand, right? And like that's sort of why experience is so fraught for Leibniz. Why it's so hard to know things clearly and distinctly from experience is because everything that we can clearly and distinctly know, or at least relatively clearly and relatively distinctly know in experience, is all composed of stuff that we don't know, right? And so, sort of like what Leibniz imagines is that in everything that we see, ultimately, is like this entire, like almost universe worth of experience of aspects of our perception that show up that are not clear and distinct to us, right? Think about, for example, hair, right? You get the shape of the hair, right? But you don't know how many or anything like that, right? And so that's what Leibniz has in mind, is that every perception carries these imperceptible perceptions as their parts, right? Because obviously you only see someone's hair, right, as like a general shape by seeing in an indistinct and imperfect way all of the individual hairs, right? Similarly with an ocean, similarly with any body that we see, because they're going to be a composite, right? I just think that that's a really cool and interesting and very accurate um, analysis about our perception, and sort of helps illuminate why it is that Leibniz thinks that, we're so deep in the waters, right? Whenever we're trying to consult our own experience, and why our experience is so opaque to us, right? Even the things that are in front of us, right, are all composed of things that we don't understand, right? Um, Okay, that's enough for this week. I hope that that was illuminating. I hope that you kind of understand the foundations of empiricism and Leibniz's objections, and we'll continue with Locke and some others next week.